Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to two of our speakers. Mr. Siew, who is an executive director with Deloitte's risk advisory practice based in Malaysia. He has more than 18 years of experience in risk and controls, encompassing IT audit and advisory, cybersecurity assessment services for clients in various industries, focusing on the banking and insurance industries. We also have Peter Marini, who is the managing director of the APAC region. Peter has more than 20 years experience in technology and sales with various companies. And throughout his career, Peter has focused on helping organizations with their business challenges, from securing their environment to improving their relationships with the customers. So let me quickly go over the agenda and the format of the webinar now. Siew will first share his insights on the cybersecurity space, the trends and the impact of COVID-19. Peter will then talk about digital transformation and the changing fraud landscape. Both of these speakers will try to address COVID-19 related challenges and its long-term impact on banks. Once they share their initial views on recent market developments and also its impact on banks, I will ask the speakers to respond to a number of questions, any issues or challenges faced by banks today. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat window. With this, I'll invite Siew to share his thoughts on cybersecurity's new normal and its impact. Okay.
Good day, Shabana. Can I just check that you can hear me well?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I guess today, let's just talk a bit about cybersecurity. And, it's a hot topic these days, whether COVID or no COVID, where malicious actors seek to take advantage of our online presence, to extract sensitive data, deny services, or even steal money. But, COVID-19 has led to this so-called new normal for cybersecurity. And so today, as Shabana has mentioned, we will talk about, how we need to think about doing things slightly differently and perhaps anticipate the kind of things that might come in the future. So what we're going to do today is to talk about trends, impacts, and considerations for cybersecurity resulting from COVID-19. And you'll see that in the left-hand side of the chart in front of you. So we'll divide this into two. The first would be the shorter-term considerations that are shown on this slide. And it's really about how companies have reacted in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown, kind of what's happening now as we speak. And we'll also, on my next slide later on, talk about the longer-term kind of economic-driven implications and considerations for cybersecurity. But for now, let's talk about the short term. So if I draw your attention to trend A, what we term the rush to enable remote working. So when governments around the world announced the lockdowns, they only gave their citizens a short window of time before lockdowns were effected, often 1 or 2 days. And this really resulted in organizations really rushing to enable remote working. And drawing your attention to A1, in so doing, organizations may have fast-track technologies, VPN, BYOD, Zoom, Teams, all these collaboration platforms, and sometimes without the adequate due diligence that would normally happen in more normal times. As I draw your attention to considerations A2 and A3, we do retrospectively have to think about doing risk assessments for the new technologies that we have implemented, if we haven't already. And especially so for remote access and VPN security, because much of our organizations will continue working from home from time to time using such technologies in the future as well. Moving on, let's look at trend B, what we term as cybersecurity supply chain disruptions. And we look at B1, some people who, when working from home, need to care for elderly or young children. And this may often cause distractions, which may actually reduce availability or productivity whilst working. And in such scenarios, could some security matters have been overlooked on a day-to-day basis? Well, maybe. And so the consideration we present to you, B2, is that given we potentially have reduced effectiveness in our day-to-day cybersecurity operations, we cannot protect everything. So organizations should think about prioritizing the critical security operations focused around their most important assets, or what we term crown jewels. If we move on to C and C1, we do definitely see malicious actors trying to take advantage of this COVID-19 situation by implanting malware or social engineering people. And they do that these days often by impersonating governments or other authorities such as the World Health Organization, send an email purporting to be WHO or a relevant authority on COVID-19. And given how interested we are as a society on COVID-19, we browse and click on everything related to COVID-19, is there a higher chance of users falling for these schemes? Definitely. And so we think about the considerations C2 and C3, we do absolutely need to ensure that our workforce is trained to spot these new schemes. And we also need to ensure that there is an early warning system in place where one person who does spot such an attack can easily trigger an alert to the rest of the organization. And finally, talking about trend D and I guess cybersecurity impact D1, with all that went on, A, B, and C, the new technologies, the reduced productivity in security, increased success rate for phishing and social engineering, there is a high probability that these malicious actors have already taken advantage in the early days when all of this happened and may already have infiltrated our environments. And so in talking about consideration D2, we do need to assume that we have been breached and we need to actively perform what we call compromise assessments. And what that is proactively hunting within our environments, machines that are already compromised, already controlled by attackers, and cleaning them up before the attackers can do any further damage. So all those were the short-term reactions to temporary disruption. Shabana, may I move to the next slide, please? And so on this slide, we will talk about the longer term reactions to the economic climate. So there is a lot of speculation about an impending economic downturn as a result of COVID-19. So what we'll do here is we'll take a quick look as to what organizations will face in longer term when this mooted downturn eventually hits. So I draw your attention to E and I guess E1. Now, in a downturn, unfortunately, the first thing to go, COVID or no COVID, are non-profit generating functions such as security. Now, alongside what we mentioned earlier about prioritizing the critical security operations that are focused on the most critical assets and crown jewels, we do in the future need to think about what model, in-source, outsource, is best to sustain the security operations in light of a tougher economic climate. Moving on to F and suppose impact F1, given the economic crisis, now whether it's for survival or just in instances where larger organizations seek to take advantage of this situation and build capabilities by acquiring struggling smaller companies, we will see some merger and acquisition activity. And we do need to take lessons from the Marriott acquisition a few years back where they acquired some hotels. And it was later revealed that those hotels had been suffering from data breaches. And so I draw your attention to F2. We do need to ensure that as we embark on these merger and acquisition activities, we do not neglect cybersecurity due diligence. And ultimately, this involves all the things we talked about earlier, right? Ensuring that controls at the targets are in place, doing the compromise assessments that we talked about, etc. And I leave you with, I guess, trend G, really talking about the change in IT and business environment that we'll start to face longer term. And so our businesses will start to change in reaction to the new economic climate. For instance, G1, job losses and reduced remuneration may actually lead to more disgruntled employees working within our organization, and this could lead to greater insider threats. Another point to note, G2, as we continually work remotely in the future, we will go more digital. And so we will see continued adoption of all the things we talked about, the BYOD, the cloud, the new technology. And so going through the considerations, G3, G4, and G5, when we think about investing in new technologies that help us spot threats in such a changed environment, examples are data leakage prevention, DLP, or user and entity behavior analytics technologies. These are some examples that help us differentiate legitimate from malicious activities. Yeah? Also to note, G4, security appliances that we have implemented within our organizations today are only as good as what we teach them to do and how we configure them. And so ultimately, we need to ensure that these devices and appliances that we have are properly tuned to cater for this new environment that we will potentially operate in. And finally, G5, as we move forward, we do continually need to evaluate if the controls that we've changed are working effectively to spot these new threats. That's all I I have. We've run through trends in cybersecurity from COVID-19. We've talked about impacts and considerations. What we ultimately think about as COVID-19 has hit us and continues to impact us going on in the future. But this is ultimately an unprecedented situation, and who knows what else we may face in the coming months and years. With that, Shabana, I pass it back to you.
Thank you, Suke. I will now ask Peter Marini to share his views on the current state of the market and evolving fraud landscape. Peter?
Thanks, Shabana. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Just to give some context for those of you who don't know who NetGuardians are, we're focused on transactional fraud. Some of my views presented today on the landscape will be through that lens. So one of the things, unfortunately, that occurs with all natural disasters is that we see an increase in fraud. This is due to people trying to take advantage of others' fears and insecurities. In this case, we're seeing things such as frauds around masks, COVID remedies, COVID preventative medicines, charities, and unfortunately in Australia, my home country, we're even seeing fraud around puppies. But generally speaking, we've been talking to many of the customers of NetGuardians to understand if there's some way that we could be of assistance through this epidemic or pandemic. And one of the things that they've told us is that in retail banking, they haven't seen a large increase in fraud. It tends to be around the same level as prior to COVID-19. That isn't the case in wealth and private banking. There has been a little bit of an uptake there. And you would think that that's a good sign. Unfortunately, the problem is that fraud was already at a very high level. So it's just extended the messaging. Now, when we've spoken to these banks, some of the concerns that they have had has been around internal fraud and privacy. As Suki said, having to move very hastily into working from home, there is a concern that some of the policies and procedures weren't implemented as strictly as maybe they would be at a work from office environment. Some of them were relaxed to be able to accommodate this work from home environment. Some of the other things that we suspect is that some of the banks that were marketing end-to-end digital may have been hit with some gaps in that process where they thought that they had covered end-to-end, but now all of a sudden when you see, all of Singapore working from home, everything has to be digital, some of those gaps will become highlighted or exacerbated. Another thing that we've seen is that many of the banks that had plans to move to digital, so they were looking at latter 2020, 2021, moving some of their functions to digital, have reprioritized these projects and moving them forward. And then obviously you've got the concerns for those banks and or countries that hadn't kind of started to implement digital banking, having to play and rush to catch up. Now, one of the advantages to that is obviously you can learn from everyone who is prior to you, but it means that you've got to do a lot of work very, very quickly. And one of the things that I suspect we'll see is a larger interest in cloud solutions, whether that be for core banking, for fraud prevention, or other features that allow the banks to both turn up and turn on capabilities. And this just isn't in relation to supporting their customers, but it's also in supporting their employees. If all of a sudden you have to turn on your digital capabilities so that you're getting 30% of your transactions via digital to now being 100%, there's a lot of extra bandwidth that you've got to take advantage or take into account. But also employees, if all of a sudden you're going from 10 video conferences a month to 1,000 video conferences a month, these sorts of things are going to have an impact on the infrastructure that you currently have deployed in the bank prior to this 100% or 80% work from home environments. Thanks, Shabana.
Peter, did you want to add more?
So that was with relation to one of the questions that we had that we were going to talk to.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Thank you, both Peter and Suke. It's really interesting to see and to understand the short-term as well as the long-term impact of the situation facing us all today. I will now take the questions from the audience so the speakers can help clarify some of the challenges or the concerns you are facing. I do have a question for both the speakers, so let's start from there. With COVID-19, business activities have generally been reduced, right? Does that mean the cyber and fraud risk has reduced proportionately? Okay, do you want to go first?
Okay, thanks, Shabana. So I wouldn't say cyber risk has reduced proportionately just because traditional business volumes have reduced. Peter mentioned that companies are increasingly going digital. Online transactions are increasing, new technologies are being implemented, and they may not actually be securely configured. And at the same time, malicious actors know this. And with all the business disruptions that we talked about and unsecured new technologies, it is an opportune time for malicious actors to actually carry out their activities and attacks. So I'd say from a likelihood perspective, probably the risk hasn't reduced that much. But let's think about the impact perspective. And that's a different matter. As we've seen with the EasyJet hack a few days ago, companies at this point are already struggling financially in most industries. And a successful cyber attack at this point may just be the tipping point that destroys a company's chances of survival. So I think in summary, I wouldn't say that the overall cyber risk has reduced because business activities have reduced. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, thank you. Peter, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so if you want to bring up that slide that you just had up for me.
Okay.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we haven't really seen a large increase in the number of transactional frauds. We have seen obviously more what I like to or term, we've seen a marketing message change from a number of the fraud types. So, we always had things like the mobile scams. So now they're related to COVID. We've had email and phishing, and now they're attaching themselves to the marketing message has changed around the WHO, things like that. Where we may be seeing some increases are things like loan scams, as people are stuck at home, things like love scams. One of the newer ones is around employment scams, given everyone's concerns around unemployment and things like that. So those are some of the things that we've seen potentially slightly increase. But we think once the COVID position is over and we get back to a new norm, we'll again start to see those decline as people use technology to try and eliminate some of these typical fraud scenarios.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Let me go back and let's see what we have. I do have another question, Peter, for you. Most fraud systems are based on AI or machine learning today, right? Which analyzes user behavior in relation to users' historical activity. Now, COVID-19 has changed the normal behavior. Based on this new normal, wouldn't fraud-based systems leveraging AI or machine learning end up generating huge number of false positives, right? So what can banks do in a situation like this, Peter?
Sure. So I think I would agree that most fraud systems marketed today have some level of AI and machine learning attached to it. I'm not sure that most of the banks would have those solutions deployed. But if they do, one of the things that they can look at, especially on if they're running a supervised AI models, is the optimization of those models. So, NetGuardians, we've gone out to our customers and said, look, we can help you with optimization of these. But one of the things that NetGuardians does that's a little different, and we would suggest to others to look at, is to not be a black box and look at a number of different risk variables. So if you think about the new norm, so that customer that previously wrote a check to pay their rent on the 25th of every month is still paying their rent on the 25th of every month. Now they're just doing it digitally. So, what we look at is things like amounts, time of day, day of week, things like that won't have changed. It'll just be maybe the transaction type. Another thing that you can look at is peer group profiling. So are these transactions something that the bank has not done before, or the people around this transaction haven't done before? So it's not relying on just one variable. And that allows us to still be able to detect and prevent fraud in the new norm that we have today.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So continuing with the same theme of new normal, UK, I have a question for you. What does the new normal mean for cybersecurity? Does it mean that banks need to do things differently?
Thanks, Shabana. Well, I'd say, COVID-19 or no COVID-19, and everything that we have known about cybersecurity in the past, where, we talk about good cybersecurity programs, good cybersecurity hygiene, and all of this means having good defense in depth, multiple layers of defense, educating our users, and really ensuring that we can prevent or detect and also respond to threats. All of these things at a high level generally remain the same. But I think if we talk about this new normal, we probably need to think about a few different things. We probably need to think about tweaking our cybersecurity programs slightly. And the things to think about were a lot of things I mentioned earlier. How do we operate on a tighter budget and focus only on the most important things, given we can't protect everything? And that's easier said than done. A lot of organizations know what are their critical assets, and we also need to think about how effective are we really working remotely, and how do we actually train our workforce to spot the latest social engineering trends and attacks. And ultimately, we also need to think about are our existing controls and solutions properly tuned to be able to give us the best chance of preventing and detecting threats, given the new technologies that we adopt and the environment that we work in. So I'd say it's not totally different, but it does need some tweaking, and there are some additional considerations. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, I have another question for you, Suki, on lockdowns. Did movement control order in Malaysia or lockdowns implemented elsewhere hamper the effort of IT security, where some team members cannot report to work? So the question is, can they effectively operate remotely?
Thanks, Shabana. Well, given how easily a lot of organizations just shifted to that work from home model in just 1 or 2 days, I don't think the inability to physically be in an office location hampered things that much. The question about is it effective, I think it's a difficult question, and it really varies from individual to individual and from role to role. So, some people would say they thrive working remotely because they don't have things like travel time, traffic jams, and distractions from colleagues, impacting them. But others, as we discussed earlier, would have different circumstances where they have either young children or elderly that may actually take their attention away. And it's important to note that cybersecurity ultimately, no matter what technologies and solutions that we deploy, we still need people to run. We still need to tune those devices, and those devices still need to be monitored and issues reacted to. So I'd say, think about how security analysts, someone who actually monitors alerts from devices, they typically have to spot alerts as they fly by, whether it's a false positive, flag it up for investigation. Could they have potentially missed something, given that they were working in such maybe conditions where they were not 100% focused? Maybe they could have. So I'd say maybe that there could have been lapses compared to a normal day, for sure. And ultimately, we do need to think about how those lapses may have impacted our overall cybersecurity. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, so okay. So we are hearing a lot about pandemics these days, right? And it seems like COVID-19 may not be the only pandemic risk in the foreseeable future. Would cloud computing provide a more foolproof environment for cybersecurity and fraud? I would like to hear from both Peter and Suke on this. Peter, do you want to go first?
Sure, Shabana. So as I mentioned, I definitely believe that we're going to see more interest in cloud. I know it's been around for a long time, but there's been a lot of concern about regulators' acceptance. How do we do it across borders? Things like that. I'm not sure about the word foolproof. I don't think anything in technology is foolproof. But I think that the current situation has shown that thinking from a historical point of view, we need to make some changes, and it no longer makes sense for some organizations. I think that's especially true where the data is not specialized. And so I think cloud is definitely going to be looked at very closely in the more so in the near future. Not that it hasn't today, but more so. I think these sorts of environments are going to make the ability to onboard and uplift capabilities much easier than things like a local data center managed by a single bank. So, having the fact that you've got a managed cloud service is going to be a huge advantage for scaling. Shabana.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do you want to comment on this question as well?
Thank you, Shabana. So generally, I agree with what Peter has mentioned. I don't think the word foolproof is probably true in this perspective, both from a fraud and also a cybersecurity viewpoint. But having said that, cloud definitely increases the availability component of businesses. But from a more, I guess, cybersecurity perspective on data breaches and all that, I think it really depends on the organization. So for some organizations, cybersecurity inherently improves if one is moving to the cloud. So say for example, you are a small company and with limited resources, moving to the cloud service provider has better capabilities to secure the environment may actually improve your security posture overall. But I think in the end, cloud is also something like any other technology that needs to be secured. So you could procure a cloud solution, and no matter how good the cloud service providers' practices are, there may be certain responsibilities that you as a consumer need to take on in terms of ensuring what you put into the cloud, ensuring that only say authorized people within your organization have access to that data, and also certain parts of the solution that you as a consumer need to configure. And if you don't configure that securely, then ultimately it is still insecure. So I guess the short answer is, it really depends on how you secure the cloud. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, so next is an interesting question, and I will ask Peter to respond to this one. It's on business model. How do you envision things changing for banks in the next few years due to COVID-19? Will their business models change? And how does this affect new digital banks, Peter?
Thanks, Shabana. So I think most of the banks have been very aware that the business model is going to be changing to a digital end-to-end, and you've seen many of the banks marketing that. Not just banks, but many organizations doing that. I think, as I mentioned earlier, some of the acceleration that we've seen because of COVID might have highlighted some gaps in those processes. And I'll give you an example. It's not bank related, but I'll give you an example. I recently was during the COVID process, trying to sign up to a new insurance product. And Singapore has been very digital aware for a long time. But my insurance provider, for the very first time, was looking at how do they fill and complete applications, sign applications 100% digitally. And this was the first time the insurance agent had ever done it, and the first time that the insurance company had approved the signing and signature of these digitally, even though, as I mentioned, Singapore has been very digital for quite some time. So you started to see, maybe the thought of being end-to-end was there, and some gaps might have been highlighted. With regard to the new digital banks, I think obviously, firstly, there'll be a delay here in Singapore, at least, in the deployment. But I think this might actually, it's going to be a double-edged sword for the new digital banks. I think the positive is going to be that people that may not have been digital ready, maybe the older generations and things like that, have been forced to become digital ready. And so their market space will have increased. But I think the other edge of that sword is people are going to be a little nervous about moving banks during this economic uncertainty. So they may just stick with the provider that they trust. And as long as that provider that they trust makes sure that all of those capabilities are done, digital capabilities are there, it'll be harder to get them to move. But I think once the economic situation settles down, we get back to kind of a life of normal, I think you'll see things change where they're willing to trust these new digital banks and make those moves to them.
Okay, that's great. So let's move on to a somewhat different topic. We often rightly or wrongly assume that the threat actors will focus on large banks and to a small extent, mid-sized banks. The size of the bank really matters. Suke, I would like both the speakers to comment on this, but Suke, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Shabana. So I wouldn't say the size of the bank matters, because ultimately a malicious actor or a cyber criminal would normally go for the easiest target or the lowest hanging fruit, right? So whilst a small bank may have less resources, they may have less to secure and less complexity. And when we think about a large bank, they may have more business units. And whilst they may have larger budgets and more security solutions, they may also have some weak spots within the overall organization that people can take advantage of. And this may actually even change from time to time. You could be very secure one day, but with some merger and acquisition activity, some business changes like work from home, there may be some lapses in security regardless of the size. So I really don't think the size of the bank matters. I think cybersecurity is for all sizes of banks, and for that matter, all sizes of organizations. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, Peter, do you want to comment on this one as well?
Sure. Look, I think ultimately, like all of us, whether you're trying to manage your budget at home or trying to manage, a software company across Asia Pacific, it's all about kind of the return on investment. and this is even fraudsters, how much work am I going to have to put into this to get the reward? If you think about the investment made, as we understand, to do the Bangladesh heist, it was 24 months, 20 to 24 months of preparation. So the question, I guess, would be, as Suki put it, are the controls of the SME banks, the small medium banks, are the controls going to be as rigid as the bigger banks? Are the smaller banks going to have the resources to phone customers to see, if a particular transaction was fraudulent or not? And so I suspect that these fraudsters will look at, how do we attack a particular market and hit multiple banks at the same time? So maybe go into a Myanmar or a Cambodia or a Vietnam or whatever, or a Singapore, do a fraud on a number of banks simultaneously, and then move to another country. And I think that one's going to be the plan. And as Suki said, I don't think it really matters whether it's a large or small. I just think it's going to be, do they have the energy and the bandwidth to be able to put in the effort for that bigger bank, or just go after those small hanging fruits?
Okay, that's really interesting to know that the size does not really matter. It depends on the process, what their goal is, and how they're trying to achieve their goal. So thank you for that. So Suki, you had earlier talked about remote working, right? So does working from home introduce additional cybersecurity risk for ordinary users? And if your answer is yes, what should banks do?
Hi, Shabana. Thanks. So I think this also ties in with the question that we see on screen at the moment around, mobile devices of employees having been compromised as they use them to do their daily work. So I guess it really depends, that there are various models of working from home. A lot of them are commissioned by, company issued devices where the employee has a laptop, is able to bring it home, and that machine is subject to the same patching and malware solutions and other controls that the organization would have rolled out to that machine in the first place. On the other hand, you have probably a looser model where employees are allowed to connect to enterprise networks using their own personal mobile devices. So absolutely, if employees are using their own personal mobile devices, then there is an additional security risk because you don't have control as an organization over the activities on that personal mobile device. So central to remote working has been the concept of mobile device management, where an organization retains the ability to, by virtue of installing an agent on the mobile device, by virtue of installing malware protection solutions on the mobile device, is able to either securely wipe or track where the device is and also monitor certain things on the device. There are also controls which ensure that, for instance, you can't actually copy things like your email onto other working applications within your mobile device. So ultimately, the best model to have is a mobile device management scheme that you roll out to your end users' your end users' mobile devices. And in thinking of that, in the same way as we talked about how we do compromise assessments to hunt threats and find out whether certain devices are maybe connecting out to known bad IP addresses or showing some signs of being compromised, you can then also monitor these mobile devices for such activity. If compromised, clean them up. Thanks, Shabana.
Okay, thank you. I will ask both the speakers to share their views on the next question. As organizations restart their business operations, what are the top 3 things, or I would say key things they should focus on to enhance their fraud and cyber defense? Peter, do you want to take this question first?
Sure, Shabana. So look, I think, so the first thing would be to continue providing those digital services, and enhancing those, for both from a customer service point of view, but also from a security point of view, making sure that it's both usability and also safe for their clients. I think look at the employee engagement. How are they working? How can they work from home? Is it possible to continue to provide this service to let your employees work from home? Maybe have a fire drill on it so that if we get into this scenario again, they are prepared. And obviously, I'm biased, so make sure that your security, be it cybersecurity or fraud systems, are in place, are updated, are up to date, and are leveraging the latest technology like AI to be able to manage those frauds and keep them at bay while you keep those customers secure.
Okay. Okay, do you want to comment on the same question?
Well,
Top three things. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, well, also I think I've already kind of touched upon them, and as I think about this, I don't think my top three is any different from any other normal day. So my top three would be, firstly, to protect the most critical assets within your organizations. And as I said earlier, it's not as easy as just saying it. It's a lot of organizations don't actually know what their most critical assets are, let alone be able to protect them. And especially in larger organizations where you have many different departments, you may actually have to drill down and prioritize them on a case-by-case basis. The second thing is to assume that you've already been compromised. So we face a lot of sophisticated threats these days, COVID or no COVID. And ultimately, looking out for compromised machines and devices in your environment would probably be something which is quite important to ensure that no further damage actually happens. And I think the final thing is, again, COVID or no COVID, the weakest link is always the user. So we need to always ensure that we've got good awareness and training programs for our employees, and in the midst of this COVID-19 situation in particular, they are able to spot what is, for example, a phishing email from, say, an purported authority by the WHO. Yeah, so my top three.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I have a question for Peter on business case. Oftentimes, banks find it hard to justify investment in fraud solutions and develop a viable business case, right? You would agree that fraud groups are considered cost centers for bank and not revenue generators. When the cost of fraud, at least what banks are aware of, is less than the price of fraud solution, how should they justify investment? Or what advice can you give them, Peter?
So the first one, I guess, would be when the cost is less than the price of fraud. The first question I would ask is, do they know all of the fraud that exists within the bank? We've done a number of proof of concepts where the bank has said within this particular amount of data, we have X number of fraud. And what we've discovered is that there is actually more fraud than they were aware of. So the first question would be, do you know every single fraud that's in your environment? The next thing I would talk about is kind of the total cost. Yes, there is the loss of revenue from that particular fraud, but there's also loss of reputation. And banks are ultimately businesses built on trust. I give you my money and I trust it'll be there. And so if that level of trust is declining due to the fact that you're losing money because of fraud, it's going to have an impact on your customers. But it'll also have an impact on your employee morale. If people want to be able to talk about the company that they work for with pride, and it doesn't make it very easy to do if in the press there's X bank is losing money due to fraud. The other part of this equation would also be investors. So it's going to be hard or harder to get investors if one of your line items is hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of loss in the bottom line due to fraud. And a good way to look at that reputational component is many companies give a value to their brand. And so if you look at the brand value of an organization and minus 10, 15, 20%, that's the overall cost to that brand reputation component. And so that would be the way I would suggest, Shabana.
Okay, thank you for that, Peter. So we have time for one last question. What learning can we all take from the current pandemic? It would be good to hear from both of you. Okay.
Shabana. Yeah. So actually, I will answer this not from a cybersecurity perspective, but overall business perspective. We've had what you can call black swan events, I guess, with things like 9/11 and now COVID. I think this really serves as a stark reminder for us as businesses that things will not always be rosy. We do have to plan for hugely unprecedented negative events. And if we think about the business continuity aspects of our businesses, I feel a lot of them are almost paper-based exercises. We never really consider the practical implications of business continuity. And ultimately, I think this pandemic has taught us, as with 9/11, that these things are real and it can impact us really hard when such things actually do happen. So be prepared for the worst.
Okay, Peter. Thank you, Suke. Peter, any concluding thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I think I'd extend what Suki said. Be like the Boy Scouts. Be prepared. Build up the ability to think outside the previous working and engagement models. Make sure that customer and employee engagement is as frictionless as possible. I've been in the IT space for a long time, and we always had BCP policies where there would be tests of the data center goes down, does it fall over to the disaster recovery center? Does the call center go down? The location you can't get to. So we've got another one. And I think now we need to extend that to look at, all right, what happens if we can't, as an employer, we can't get our employees to the office? Or what if our customers can't get to us? What is another means for us to still be able to interact? And I think that that's in line with what Suki said.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for today's session. I hope you found the session useful and we helped address some of your questions or the challenges facing you. If you didn't get the chance to ask your question, please send us an email and we'll get back to you with the answers. We will also send you the link to the recording. We have participants today from all over APAC and some from Europe as well. So thank you all for joining the session.